April 1945, a makeshift POW camp in southern Germany. The morning fog clings to the barbed wire, obscuring the surrounding forest in a pale gray haze. Inside the compound, rows of wooden huts stand silent, their windows darkened by curtains drawn against the weak spring sunlight. A group of German women, weary from months of displacement and fear, move cautiously between the huts. Their eyes dart at every sound: boots on gravel, the snap of a gate, the distant bark of a guard dog. They have learned to measure each step, each word, in a world ruled by authority and unpredictability. Suddenly, the sharp call of an American guard cuts through the stillness. But it is different this time. The voice is low, careful, almost measured. There is no bark, no command, no harshness that would signal control through intimidation. The women stop, hearts racing, their instincts alert to threat. It is a small thing, barely noticeable, yet it stuns them. The guards lower their voices. Each command, each instruction, comes with deliberate calm. In that quiet, the women sense something unfamiliar. Authority exercised without aggression, control tempered by restraint, and a fragile recognition of their humanity amidst the chaos of war. By early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling under the relentless pressure of Allied forces advancing from both east and west. German cities lay in ruins, transport networks were shattered, and supply lines were fragmented. Amid this collapse, large numbers of civilians and military personnel found themselves displaced, interned, or captured. Among them were female prisoners of war, many of whom had lived through bombings, forced evacuations, and the loss of family members. The role of women in Germany during the war had been complex. With men conscripted to the front lines, women often assumed critical responsibilities in agriculture, industry, and civil administration. Yet they were also subjected to the strains of total war, rationing, air raids, and the constant presence of authority that regulated every aspect of daily life. Their lives had been defined by obedience and survival, and trust in authority had been severely eroded. When the Americans advanced into German territory, they encountered these civilian populations and captured personnel under precarious conditions. The U.S. military faced not only the logistical challenge of providing food, shelter, and security, but also the delicate task of administering order without exacerbating fear. Female POWs, in particular, presented a unique set of challenges. Many were young, traumatized, and accustomed to the rigid discipline and harsh treatment of German guards. American military doctrine at the time emphasized the importance of humane treatment for prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Commanders understood that the psychological state of prisoners could significantly influence camp order and the efficiency of administrative operations. Harsh or authoritarian enforcement often led to resistance, escape attempts, or unrest. Conversely, measured treatment could stabilize a volatile environment, reduce friction, and facilitate cooperation. Within the camps, the behavior of guards became a critical factor in shaping daily life. Unlike previous experiences with harsh authority, American soldiers were trained to observe, understand, and mitigate tensions. Lowering their voices in the presence of female prisoners was a deliberate tactic. It minimized fear, demonstrated restraint, and acknowledged the prisoner's humanity while maintaining clear control of the environment. These practices were not common in all armies at the time. The American approach contrasted sharply with the treatment female POWs had endured under the German system, where strict rules, shouting, and arbitrary punishment were frequent. For women accustomed to authority as an instrument of fear, the deliberate calm of the U.S. Guards was disorienting. It challenged assumptions and created a psychological space in which trust, however tentative, could begin to form. This initial period of occupation set the stage for interactions that were as much about perception and psychology as about security. The female POWs, sensitive to every cue, observed closely how soldiers moved, how they spoke, and how they enforced rules. These small details, the tone of voice, the measured pace, the attention to dignity, became the markers by which prisoners assessed whether authority could be both firm and humane. In this environment, the lowering of voices was not a trivial matter. It was a subtle signal of respect and restraint, an intentional acknowledgement of the prisoner's vulnerability and personal dignity. It provided a foundation upon which the broader framework of humane treatment, compliance, and eventual rehabilitation could be built. By addressing fear not through coercion but through deliberate calm, American Guards introduced a new paradigm in POW management, one in which discipline coexisted with empathy, and authority was exercised with awareness of human limits. This nuanced approach would soon produce tangible effects, reshaping the prisoner's perception of power and authority within the confines of the camp. As the war drew closer to its conclusion, the sheer scale of captivity presented unprecedented challenges. Female POWs were housed in converted military facilities, temporary barracks, and sometimes commandeered schools or factories. These locations were often overcrowded, with limited sanitation and strained resources. Amid these conditions, the psychological climate became as critical as the physical one. Fear, mistrust, and trauma had the potential to escalate tensions, making the behavior of guards a decisive factor in maintaining order. American military leadership recognized this reality. Officers implemented strict protocols for interactions, emphasizing calm, deliberate communication, and careful observation. Guards were instructed to avoid shouting or displays of aggression, particularly when dealing with women and vulnerable civilians. Each command was to be delivered in a controlled tone, and gestures of respect, such as pausing before entering living quarters or speaking quietly during inspections, were encouraged. This approach stemmed not only from legal obligations under the Geneva Conventions, but also from practical experience. Fear-driven compliance could be unstable, while respect-based discipline fostered lasting order. For the German female prisoners, these practices were initially confounding. Many had internalized years of authoritarian control, where any encounter with guards could bring humiliation or punishment. The sudden absence of shouting, the measured cadence of instructions, and the lowered voices of American personnel disrupted deeply ingrained expectations. It was as if the very air had changed. Authority remained, but without the intimidation that had always accompanied it. The contrast to previous treatment was stark. Under German military authority, female POWs had endured strict regimentation, shouted orders, intrusive inspections, and arbitrary punishments were standard. Compliance had been enforced through fear, not understanding. The Americans, by contrast, emphasized consistency, restraint, and awareness of the prisoner's dignity. Every interaction was a lesson in controlled power. Commands remained firm, but the human cost of fear was consciously minimized. This atmosphere created subtle but profound psychological shifts. Women began to test the boundaries of behavior, responding to instructions, moving more confidently within the barracks, and engaging with guards in small, cautious ways. Trust, still tentative, started to emerge. Prisoners noted the difference between the American and German approaches. Authority could exist without aggression, control could be exercised without humiliation. These realizations, small as they were, had lasting effects on morale and cooperation. The operational implications were significant. Camps where guards adhered to these principles reported fewer incidents of conflict, reduced tension during inspections, and greater overall compliance with rules. Female POWs were more likely to follow schedules, assist with camp maintenance, and communicate important information. The calm enforcement of authority created an environment where discipline did not require constant coercion, a critical factor in managing large populations under stressful conditions. The lowering of voices in particular became emblematic of this new approach. It was a simple yet powerful tool, signaling restraint and empathy while preserving command authority. Each interaction reinforced the broader framework of humane treatment, creating consistency across the camp and setting a tone of predictability. Over time, this consistent behavior reshaped prisoners' perceptions. Fear was no longer the default response to authority, and dignity could coexist with captivity. By the spring of 1945, these practices had established a precedent. Female POWs began to see that compliance did not necessitate degradation and that their humanity could be acknowledged even under strict military control. The calm, measured approach of the American Guards laid the groundwork for subsequent interactions, shaping not only daily routines but also long-term perceptions of authority, justice, and personal dignity. In this way, the careful management of voice, gesture, and behavior became more than procedural protocol. It became a psychological instrument of order, trust, and humane governance. The scene was set for deeper exploration into how these principles played out across multiple angles of the POW experience. The experience of German female POWs under American custody can be examined from multiple interwoven perspectives: human, tactical, leadership, and moral, each revealing the depth of impact caused by subtle but deliberate gestures, such as the lowering of voices. For the prisoners themselves, the lowered voices were profoundly disorienting. Many had lived under authoritarian rule where authority equaled intimidation. Shouting was synonymous with control, and compliance was enforced through fear. To encounter guards speaking softly, with patience and restraint, was both shocking and transformative. These gestures suggested acknowledgement of the prisoner's humanity, a recognition absent in prior interactions with German military authority. The effect was immediate. Tension eased, small acts of cooperation became possible, and women began to cautiously navigate the camp environment with a renewed sense of personal dignity. Even a simple conversation, spoken without aggression, carried weight. It was a signal that they were seen as individuals rather than extensions of a defeated nation. From a military standpoint, the strategy of lowering voices was deliberate and practical. Crowded camps with tens of thousands of detainees were inherently volatile. Aggressive enforcement risked unrest or outright rebellion. By using calm, measured communication, American guards reduced stress-induced reactions and minimized the potential for conflict. Compliance became voluntary, not coerced. The approach improved efficiency in the distribution of rations, organization of living spaces, and adherence to camp schedules. Small changes in tone produced disproportionate effects, allowing soldiers to maintain authority while stabilizing potentially chaotic situations. Commanders understood that the psychological state of prisoners reflected directly on operational effectiveness. Officers trained guards to recognize the subtle signals of fear and discomfort and to modulate their behavior accordingly. Lowering one's voice in the presence of female POWs was a conscious extension of leadership principles. Authority does not need to be shouted. Control does not require intimidation. By modeling restraint, leadership permeated every level of the camp hierarchy. Supervisors reinforced the message consistently, ensuring that lower-ranking personnel adhered to protocols that prioritized calm over coercion. There was also a profound ethical dimension. The Geneva Conventions mandated humane treatment of prisoners, but adherence often varied across theaters of war. In German POW camps, female prisoners had frequently experienced violations of these principles. By contrast, American soldiers implemented measures that went beyond compliance, aiming to preserve dignity and reduce suffering. Lowering voices was a tangible symbol of this commitment, a deliberate acknowledgement that respect for the individual was possible even amid the exercise of authority. It communicated moral consistency. Prisoners could be controlled without being dehumanized, disciplined without being demeaned. These angles converge to reveal a complex interaction between psychology, military discipline, and ethics. The lowered voices were not mere courtesy. They were a tool of governance, a method of stabilizing the camp environment, and a signal of humanity amidst the chaos of war. For the prisoners, the effect was transformative. Fear was replaced with cautious trust, compliance with reluctant engagement, and suspicion with tentative understanding. The encounter between American guards and German female POWs also had a subtle cultural dimension. Many of the women had been raised in a society that emphasized rigid hierarchies and obedience to authority. Yet authority had historically been enforced through intimidation and fear. When American soldiers consciously lowered their voices, it challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about power dynamics. Civilians were forced to recalibrate their understanding of authority. Control could exist without aggression, rules could be enforced without humiliation, and obedience could be motivated by respect rather than terror. This cultural dissonance initially created surprise and even suspicion, but it eventually fostered a grudging respect and a willingness to cooperate within the constraints of the camp. The lowered voices had measurable psychological effects. Continuous exposure to aggressive commands can trigger heightened stress responses, anxiety, and learned helplessness. By contrast, calm and measured speech mitigated these responses, allowing prisoners to regain a sense of agency within a controlled environment. Female POWs began to act with more deliberate autonomy, lining up for meals without coercion, performing assigned tasks efficiently, and communicating with guards when necessary. The quiet authority of the American soldiers created a stable psychological framework, reducing incidents of panic, resistance, and disorder. Over time, prisoners reported feeling safer, despite their continued captivity. On an operational level, the practice enhanced efficiency and security. Camps were often understaffed, with soldiers responsible for managing hundreds or thousands of prisoners. Each encounter that avoided conflict conserved manpower and reduced the need for punitive measures. Lowering voices, maintaining restraint, and signaling respect were small actions with outsized effects on camp administration. Smooth cooperation allowed resources, food, medical care, and shelter to be distributed effectively, reducing tension and preventing disruptions that could compromise the mission. Commanders recognized that maintaining a humane, psychologically attuned approach improved operational outcomes while upholding ethical standards. Beyond immediate tactical and psychological effects, these interactions had lasting societal implications. Prisoners who experienced humane treatment during captivity carried those lessons into post-war life. The memory of restraint and respect influenced their perceptions of authority, governance, and justice. Women who had once equated authority with fear learned that control could coexist with empathy. These experiences subtly contributed to post-war reconciliation and the rebuilding of trust in institutions. Across these angles, a consistent theme emerges. The lowered voices were not incidental. They were an intentional, multidimensional strategy. They combined human psychology, cultural awareness, operational efficiency, leadership discipline, and moral obligation into a coherent approach that reshaped the POW experience. Small gestures, when executed with consistency and awareness, created ripples of influence that extended far beyond the immediate interaction. The cumulative effect of these angles reached its apex in the climactic moments when the prisoner's perception of authority shifted fundamentally. What began as surprise and disorientation evolved into a profound recognition. Humane treatment could coexist with control, and dignity could be preserved even in captivity. May 1945. The war in Europe had reached its final days. Across Germany, towns and villages bore the scars of relentless bombardment, while columns of Allied forces moved with precision and urgency. Within the POW camps, tension and uncertainty permeated the air. Female prisoners had observed the soldiers' behavior for weeks, noting each careful gesture, each lowered voice. But a pivotal moment was approaching, one that would crystallize the lessons of restraint, respect, and humane authority. On a warm morning, a group of American guards was tasked with conducting a routine inspection of a cluster of huts. The women had gathered along the paths, their expressions wary but attentive. The commanding officer, aware of the delicate balance of authority and trust, instructed his men to speak quietly, to maintain deliberate movements, and to observe the prisoners' reactions. As the soldiers moved from hut to hut, the change was immediately apparent. Steps were measured, voices subdued, and gestures non-threatening. A young woman, previously tense and hesitant, found herself able to meet a guard's eyes without flinching. The air, once thick with fear, now carried an almost tangible sense of cautious reassurance. The officers paused at the entrance of one hut, addressing an elder woman who had quietly observed the camp for weeks. Rather than shouting orders or issuing commands, the officer lowered his voice and offered a clear, deliberate explanation of the day's schedule, ensuring she understood each instruction. The elder's face, marked by years of hardship, displayed a flicker of disbelief, followed by a tentative acceptance. She nodded slowly. For the prisoners witnessing the scene, this was unprecedented. Authority exercised without intimidation, control asserted without fear. The psychological impact was immediate. Conversations that had previously been tense and guarded became more fluid. Prisoners began to respond proactively, volunteering information about logistical issues, medical concerns, and daily routines. Cooperation increased dramatically. The lowered voices had transformed an abstract principle into a lived reality. Compliance and respect were not mutually exclusive. This turning point also revealed the strategic importance of cultural and psychological intelligence. Soldiers who had internalized these principles understood that their conduct shaped the prisoner's behavior far more than brute force ever could. The calm, deliberate approach ensured that operations could proceed efficiently with minimal risk of unrest. Each careful word reinforced the boundaries of authority while simultaneously preserving dignity, a balance rarely observed in wartime internment situations. Across the camp, similar interactions unfolded. Small groups of prisoners, previously anxious or defiant, now engaged with guards with measured caution. Orders were followed more consistently. Tensions, once palpable, diminished visibly. The cumulative effect was a camp environment that, while still governed by military authority, now allowed for human interaction, empathy, and mutual recognition. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For the first time, the prisoners experienced authority in a form that respected their humanity. Fear, which had dominated their perception of guards for months, gave way to tentative trust. The lowering of voices, so subtle in execution, had become a catalyst for a profound psychological shift. It marked the point at which the principles of humane treatment, ethical command, and operational efficiency converged into a tangible reality. The calm authority of the American soldiers, sustained over weeks and crystallized in this inspection, illustrated a broader lesson. Even in the midst of war, deliberate restraint and empathy could reshape relationships between captors and captives. It demonstrated that power exercised with awareness and humanity could yield compliance, cooperation, and psychological stability, outcomes that brute force alone could never achieve. This moment set the stage for the subsequent developments in the aftermath of captivity, revealing not just the immediate effects of humane conduct, but also its long-term implications for trust, morale, and societal perception. As May 1945 progressed, the German surrender formalized, the dynamics within the POW camps evolved further. The female prisoners, having witnessed repeated acts of measured authority, began to internalize a new framework of interaction. Guards no longer represented arbitrary fear, but became agents of structured, humane control. The lowered voices, once shocking, had become a signal, a cue that authority could coexist with respect. One notable incident captured the essence of this transformation. A small group of women had gathered near a supply distribution point, where tensions could easily flare due to scarcity. A disagreement arose over rations, voices rising in frustration. American guards approached, their presence commanding yet unthreatening. Rather than raising their own voices to assert dominance, the soldiers spoke softly, issuing calm, clear instructions while maintaining firm posture. The women, initially startled, gradually quieted, recognizing that compliance would be met with fairness rather than punishment. Within minutes, order was restored, not through fear but through controlled communication. This moment underscored a critical principle. The psychological state of prisoners dictated the effectiveness of authority. Traditional methods of coercion might have achieved immediate compliance, but they risked long-term resentment, covert resistance, or disorder. The Americans demonstrated that measured empathetic control could achieve both obedience and stability, creating an environment where prisoners felt sufficiently safe to engage rather than resist. The cumulative effect of weeks of disciplined restraint became most evident during roll calls and inspections. Guards addressed prisoners individually when needed, using lowered tones and deliberate pauses. Women who had initially avoided eye contact now responded confidently to instructions. Even the most skeptical prisoners began to perceive that the rules were consistent, predictable, and enforced without malice. Trust, though tentative, had begun to form, a rare commodity in wartime captivity. This turning point was not merely a tactical or psychological victory. It had broader social implications. The recognition of dignity, even in defeat, influenced how prisoners perceived authority, governance, and justice. The calm, respectful conduct of the American soldiers contrasted sharply with prior experiences under German guards, providing a model for humane engagement even in a highly controlled environment. In these final days of the war, small gestures, soft words, measured steps, lowered voices took on outsized significance. They shaped the lived experience of captivity and left an indelible mark on the memory of those who endured it. By the end of May, the POW camp had undergone a profound transformation. The environment, once defined by fear and uncertainty, now reflected a disciplined balance of authority and respect. Female prisoners moved with less hesitation, complied with directives without anxiety, and engaged in cooperative behavior that had been impossible just weeks before. The lowered voices, emblematic of this approach, had become both symbol and instrument of change, demonstrating the enduring power of humane conduct in even the harshest conditions. As Allied forces prepared to transition the administration of the camps to broader post-war governance, the lessons of these final weeks would carry forward. Soldiers and officers alike recognized that authority, when exercised with awareness, restraint, and empathy, could achieve operational success while preserving the humanity of those in captivity. The climax of this human interaction, quiet, deliberate, transformative, would set the tone for the aftermath of imprisonment and the eventual reintegration of prisoners into a devastated society. By June 1945, the immediate threats of war had receded, yet the psychological and operational consequences within POW camps were just beginning to unfold. German female prisoners, once tense and wary, had adapted to the controlled, humane environment established by American guards. The lowered voices and measured interactions had produced lasting effects. Anxiety levels decreased, compliance became more consistent, and interpersonal friction within the camps declined. Reports from camp commanders highlighted these outcomes. Incidents of insubordination, previously frequent under less disciplined supervision, had dropped sharply. Female prisoners were more willing to follow instructions, participate in camp activities, and engage with medical or logistical staff. The calm and respectful approach of the American soldiers fostered an atmosphere in which prisoners could regain a sense of agency. Psychological stress, always high in captivity, began to abate as women realized that compliance would be met with predictability rather than arbitrary punishment. Beyond the immediate camp dynamics, the approach had practical operational benefits. Guards were able to manage large populations effectively without resorting to force or coercion. Meals, medical care, and other essential services could be distributed with minimal friction. The measured conduct of soldiers reduced the need for punitive measures and allowed resources to be used more efficiently. Officers noted that even minor adjustments, such as speaking quietly, explaining instructions clearly, or acknowledging individual concerns, had amplified effects on overall camp stability. The female prisoners themselves experienced subtle but profound shifts in perception. Authority, once synonymous with intimidation, began to carry a different meaning. Soldiers' lowered voices and careful conduct challenged long-held assumptions about power, discipline, and obedience. The prisoners realized that control could exist without cruelty and that human dignity could be preserved even in captivity. This understanding slowly altered daily behavior. Women walked with more confidence, spoke with less hesitation, and engaged with guards in ways previously unimaginable. Medical and psychological assessments of prisoners further underscored the impact of humane treatment. Health outcomes improved as stress-induced illnesses decreased. Reports indicated fewer instances of panic, self-harm, or psychosomatic complaints. Prisoners who might have resisted instructions in the past now complied voluntarily, reflecting the stabilizing influence of consistent, empathetic authority. This period also illuminated broader ethical and cultural lessons. The American soldiers' behavior contrasted starkly with prior experiences under German military authority, where fear had been the primary mechanism of control. For the prisoners, the lowered voices and measured conduct were more than procedural. They symbolized respect, restraint, and recognition of their humanity. Even in defeat, they experienced a form of dignity previously denied to them, a lesson that would influence their perception of authority long after the war. As the Allies prepared for the formal transition of Germany into occupation and post-war administration, the success of humane POW management provided a model. The effectiveness of calm, deliberate conduct in fostering cooperation, psychological stability, and operational efficiency was clear. The combination of ethical responsibility and practical strategy demonstrated that authority could be exercised without dehumanization, a principle that would inform military and civilian policy in the months and years to follow. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, the lessons of restraint and humane authority extended beyond individual camps into broader considerations of post-war policy and reintegration. German female POWs, now accustomed to the measured behavior of American guards, began to internalize the principles of respect and predictable authority. The lowered voices, once a startling anomaly, had become a symbol of fairness and consistency. Women who had initially approached interactions with suspicion now responded with cautious cooperation, completing daily tasks and following directives without fear or hesitation. The impact on camp morale was profound. By fostering trust and reducing stress, the American approach diminished friction between prisoners and guards. Minor conflicts that might have escalated in harsher environments were resolved calmly, without resorting to punitive measures. Camp life became more orderly, predictable, and manageable, allowing both soldiers and prisoners to focus on essential routines such as meal distribution, sanitation, and medical care. Commanders reported that the structured yet humane methods significantly reduced incidents of resistance, escape attempts, or covert insubordination. The human consequences were equally significant. Female POWs, many of whom had endured years of war, displacement, and personal loss, experienced an unexpected recognition of their dignity. Soldiers' lowered voices and deliberate gestures created an environment where fear no longer dominated every interaction. Women began to assert minor degrees of agency, expressing concerns, offering suggestions, or simply moving through the camp with a sense of measured confidence. These small acts of autonomy reflected the deeper psychological shift initiated by consistent humane treatment. Medical reports highlighted the tangible benefits of this approach. Stress-related illnesses, previously common in overcrowded, intense camps, began to decrease. Fewer women reported anxiety-induced symptoms, and the overall health of the population improved. Mental well-being, often overlooked in wartime operations, became an indirect metric of effective management. The disciplined, respectful conduct of guards had created a stable environment that supported both physical and psychological recovery. The ethical dimension of this approach also left a lasting imprint. By demonstrating that authority could coexist with empathy, American soldiers provided a powerful counter-narrative to the fear-driven methods of authoritarian regimes. Prisoners learned that discipline did not require humiliation, and control did not necessitate cruelty. These lessons would resonate beyond the confines of the camp, shaping post-war perceptions of justice, governance, and human dignity. Operationally, the success of humane conduct reinforced broader military strategy. Efficient management of POW populations reduced the burden on guards and freed resources for other critical post-war missions. Consistency in behavior, predictability in response, and restraint in communication became guiding principles for the administration of occupied territories. The American experience demonstrated that ethical behavior and strategic efficacy were not mutually exclusive. Rather, they complemented one another, producing measurable benefits in both morale and operational efficiency. By the time the formal repatriation of German POWs began, the cumulative impact of lowered voices, deliberate gestures, and humane conduct was evident. Female prisoners emerged with a renewed sense of personal dignity, an altered perception of authority, and, in many cases, a profound respect for the principles of fairness and ethical command. The aftermath of this period illustrates how even subtle practices, quiet words, measured tones, controlled behavior, can have transformative effects on human psychology, camp stability, and post-conflict reconciliation. This foundation naturally leads into the reflective closure of the narrative, where the broader implications for history, warfare, and human interaction can be fully considered. The story of German female POWs and the lowered voices of American guards serves as a compelling reminder that even amidst the brutality of war, humanity can endure. In a world dominated by conflict, fear, and destruction, Small gestures, quiet words, measured tones, and deliberate restraint proved capable of reshaping relationships, stabilizing environments, and preserving dignity. Authority, when exercised with awareness and empathy, did not lose its force. It gained a moral weight that extended far beyond the immediate interaction. For the prisoners, this experience challenged deeply ingrained assumptions. Obedience had always been enforced through fear, yet in captivity they discovered that respect could coexist with control. This realization subtly transformed their perception of power, authority, and personal agency. It was a lesson that transcended the confines of the camp, influencing post-war attitudes toward governance, justice, and interpersonal interaction. From a military perspective, the approach demonstrated the operational value of humane conduct. Calm, deliberate management reduced conflict, improved compliance, and allowed resources to be allocated efficiently. The psychological stability of the camp, achieved through patience and empathy, proved as critical to mission success as logistical planning or tactical strategy. The American example illustrated that ethical behavior and practical efficacy are not mutually exclusive, but can reinforce one another, even in the harshest of conditions. On a broader historical scale, these moments underscore the potential for human decency to endure, even amid total war. They reveal that the principles of restraint, respect, and ethical authority are not abstract ideals, but actionable strategies with tangible effects. In a conflict defined by devastation, such lessons offer a quiet but profound counterpoint, that war need not obliterate humanity, and that dignity, however fragile, can be preserved. Ultimately, the lowered voices in the POW camps stand as a testament to the subtle power of conscience in action. They remind us that history is shaped not only by battles and strategies, but by the human choices made within them. Choices that echo far beyond the immediate moment, influencing lives, societies, and the moral fabric of the world.